You'd drive past it and never think twice. A rickety old farm shed in the middle of nowhere, but behind the rusted hinges and weather-worn walls was one of NATO's most secret Cold War bunkers, a place built not to store hay, but to survive nuclear war. In the quiet countryside of Belgium, surrounded by sheep pastures and sun-bleached fence posts, there sits a forgotten shed, the kind of place you would expect to find broken tools, maybe a tractor from the 1950s, and a few stubborn mice. But peel back the corrugated tin and shift a few wooden crates, and a reinforced steel hatch stares back at you. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a hardened NATO communication bunker, shielded from Soviet satellites, camouflaged from enemy agents, and rigged with enough gear to keep Western Europe online if all hell broke loose. How did such a critical installation end up hidden in a farmer's backyard? Who built it? Who manned it? And why was it kept secret, even from local governments? This is the story of a structure built to vanish, and the messages it carried that could have meant life or death in the nuclear age. The shed looked like something forgotten by time, warped planks nailed together at odd angles, roof sagging under the weight of moss and rain, nestled at the edge of a wheat field outside Namur, Belgium. When Henri de la Roche purchased the land in 1961, he was told the structure had been there since the war, maybe earlier, a leftover from farmers who'd fled or been conscripted, and like most Belgians who'd lived through occupation, he asked no further questions. The paperwork included no architectural plans, no blueprints, just a vague note. 1X storage structure, condition, unknown. Henri left it alone. He used the surrounding fields for barley and sheep, and over the next 36 years, the shed became a place to stash fence wire, kerosene lanterns, and, during the 80s, a rusting Peugeot that never quite started. Neighbors joked that the shed would collapse in on itself before Henri ever got around to fixing the roof. But when Henri died in the winter of '97, the land passed into the hands of his distant nephew, Luc, who had no use for barns, tractors, or sheds. He sold the property to a development firm, hoping to turn the open pastures into luxury country homes. In June of that year, during the early stages of surveying and clearing, a work crew was sent to dismantle the structure. 2 workers began prying off boards while the foreman took photos for documentation. One of them, a man named Jules, tried to pull up a rotted floorboard near the center, but the crowbar wouldn't budge it. The wood gave way with a hollow clunk, too solid, too deliberate. Beneath the splintered floor wasn't dirt or foundation. It was steel. Not a plate, not a pipe. A perfectly square metal hatch, flush with the ground, complete with a circular locking mechanism, and warning text etched in faded white letters. The words weren't in French, Dutch, or even German. They were in English. Authorized access only. Property of the North Atlantic Treaty. Organization. The site manager was called in. Police were notified. Within hours, local officials arrived, scratching their heads in the shadow of a broken-down shed that suddenly radiated international jurisdiction. Journalists followed the next day, and soon a crowd gathered, forming a loose circle around the hatch, like villagers staring into a well that wasn't supposed to exist. Someone contacted the Ministry of Defense. Someone else whispered, "Cold War," and Luc, now regretting the sale, wondered if he'd just sold land that held something worth far more than grain. The hatch was sealed tight. No hinges, no latch, just the rotary lock fused with time and rust. Attempts to open it failed, and military engineers were called in with precision tools. As local newspapers ran headlines about the NATO shed, the question buzzed across the countryside: why had no one known about this? And more unsettling, if NATO had hidden a bunker beneath a farm in Belgium, what else? Had they buried in the fields of Europe? The answer, as it turned out, was just beginning to surface. By the time the Ministry of Defense dispatched its response team to the shed outside Namur, the sun had begun to set behind the trees, casting long shadows over the rusted roof, as if nature itself was reluctant to expose what lay beneath. The hatch, now partially unsealed thanks to an acetylene torch and diamond blade saw, groaned as it was pried open, revealing a spiral staircase that descended into darkness thick with the scent of old electricity and sealed air. 2 soldiers descended first, flashlights slicing through the black, illuminating smooth concrete walls that bore no signs of decay, only dust. A layer so even it suggested decades of untouched silence. The stairs ended in a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough for two men to walk shoulder to shoulder, and as they proceeded, their footsteps echoed off the reinforced steel lining like distant gunfire. 40 meters in, they encountered the door, a reinforced blast hatch painted olive drab, bearing stenciled warnings in English, French, Dutch, and German. Restricted area, authorized access only, NATO ComSec Station 12D. A keypad and mechanical locking wheel secured it, but both had long since corroded, and with a concentrated effort, they forced it open. Beyond lay something surreal, a Cold War communications bunker, preserved like a time capsule. Fluorescent lights buzzed to life, as auxiliary power was rerouted from portable generators, casting a harsh, pale glow over a scene that hadn't changed since the late 1980s. Rows of radios, long-wave transmitters, teletype machines, and analog consoles sat humming softly. Meters and dials still functional, some even flickering, as if waiting for orders. On a desk sat an ashtray with a half-smoked cigarette. Beside it, a coffee cup fossilized with brown residue, and beneath it a notepad with English script that read, "Transmission delay. Verify Brussels uplink." Every chair was pushed back slightly, as though someone had stood up mid-shift, and never returned. Maps of Western Europe were pinned to corkboards, each marked with color-coded lines and pins indicating Relay A1, Fallback Grid E3, and handwritten notes like Red Echo active, see schedule. Emergency food rations, labeled in both NATO and U.S. Army packaging, filled cabinets in the kitchen annex, unopened, untouched. A triple-bunk sleeping quarter bore military-issue blankets folded with crisp precision. Dog-eared paperback novels lying on bedside shelves. Radiation detection instruments, Geiger counters, and emergency field manuals were neatly stacked, none missing, none disturbed. A calendar on the far wall still showed the month of August, year 1989. A clock frozen at 13:47. Not a single name tag, ID badge, or photograph remained. As if whoever was here had been wiped from the records and from memory. Technicians began cataloging the equipment, historians called for preservation, and intelligence officers whispered about possible active code books. But the question hanging in the air, thicker than dust and older than fear, was chilling in its simplicity. Why had this place been sealed with everything still inside? And where were the people who once called it operational? The bunker hadn't been abandoned. It had been entombed. And now, 30 years later, it had come back into the light. The first thing the Ministry of Defense did was deny, not publicly, but internally, in a tone sharpened by panic rather than certainty, because according to every archive, every index of NATO cooperative defense infrastructure, from the Cold War period, there should have been no military installation under Parcel B11734 of Namur's agricultural district, let alone one fortified to survive a Soviet first strike. And yet, the evidence beneath that weather-beaten shed could not be dismissed as wartime rumor or abandoned rehearsal. Within 48 hours of the bunker's discovery, a joint task group of Belgian military archivists, NATO liaisons, and civilian intelligence analysts were convened in Brussels under the codename Project Grey Vault. But despite cross-checking more than 600 declassified records from the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, they found nothing. Not one mention of a ComSec Station 12D. Not in the 1962 Integrated Defense Roadmap. Not in the 1975 Strategic Fallback Broadcast Network list. Not even in the 1984 Warsaw Pact escalation drills. And yet inside the bunker, the reality was undeniable. The encryption panels bore British manufacturer markings. The transmission terminals were West German Telefunken systems customized for secure NATO protocols, and tucked behind a rack of obsolete frequency hoppers was a ruggedized U.S. military field radio still bearing the faint stencil of Property of USAR SIGDIV 3. This was no Belgian operation. It was transatlantic, built with purpose, scale, and budget. Engineers examining the structural design were stunned to find layers of lead-lined shielding woven into the ceiling and walls, electromagnetic insulation that would have cost tens of millions in today's currency, paired with hardened blast doors capable of withstanding direct artillery fire or a low-yield tactical nuke. This isn't just Cold War vintage, one analyst murmured under her breath during a preliminary walkthrough. This was built to stay alive after everything else died. More disconcerting still was the lack of any record in Belgium's domestic construction logs. No permits, no material orders, no land use declarations. Even the concrete formula used in the tunnel bore signature traits of a rare U.S. Army Corps composite mix never exported beyond secure zones. Within a week, the discovery had gone from a curiosity to a classified asset, guarded by barbed wire, active surveillance, and a rotating detail of military police under direct orders to deny access to all journalists, historians, and even EU officials who had started sniffing around. The British MOD disclaimed involvement, issuing a sterile statement about ongoing reviews of Cold War logistical anomalies. The Americans offered silence. SHAPE issued a one-sentence memo stating that DU, no known NATO facility matches the structure in question. But everyone involved, from the Belgian colonel overseeing the site to the German communications technician examining the radios, shared the same quiet suspicion that this bunker had been built by people operating under orders that no longer existed, for a war plan that was never meant to be traced. And if it wasn't supposed to exist, who exactly gave the order to build it? And why had it been sealed, as if whatever it once heard was never meant to be remembered? The breakthrough came not from an official investigation, but from a retired NATO communications officer named Willem Drexler, who, after seeing grainy news footage of the Namur shed on a German late-night current affairs program, contacted a Brussels journalist with a single phrase. It was part of Silent Wire. That journalist, Elise Franken, had been stonewalled for weeks by ministry spokespeople and intelligence contacts, but when Drexler handed her a brittle, redacted memo dated April 1962 with a classified stamp from SHAPE's contingency planning division, everything changed. The memo, which she later leaked to a sympathetic parliamentary oversight committee, outlined the existence of Operation Silent Wire, a Cold War-era black-budget NATO program developed in direct response to Khrushchev's threats against West Berlin and intelligence reports suggesting the Soviets had hardened fallback facilities deep in the Urals. The objective was clear: ensure uninterrupted command and control in the event of a nuclear decapitation strike. If Washington, London, or Brussels were hit first, a likely scenario in any Soviet first-wave doctrine, a series of hardened, concealed communication relays would remain intact, buried under civilian infrastructure, able to retransmit orders across fractured NATO command zones. These were not to be known by host nations, or even all NATO generals. Only a select group of Allied Signals Directorate officers, cryptographic engineers, and logistics coordinators with Omega-tier clearance were aware. And among the sites listed in a heavily redacted site manifest, only one location wasn't blacked out. Station 12D, Agricultural Unit, Namur Province, Belgium. This was the shed, a deliberate obfuscation, buried in farmland, masked by decades of silence. But the memo raised more questions than it answered. Why Belgium? Why not place such a vital node inside a military base or existing communications hub? And, more curiously, why had it been abandoned and sealed rather than decommissioned, disarmed, or recycled into a civilian asset like other Cold War remnants? Former NATO strategic planner Colonel Eric Van Horn, also retired, weighed in during a televised panel, stating that Silent Wire's nodes were designed to operate alone, fully self-contained, immune to satellite disruption, and immune to politics. That last word hung heavy in the air, because buried within the implication was a far more troubling idea, that these bunkers were not just physical assets, but political contingency tools, capable of issuing battlefield commands and nuclear retaliatory signals independent of central government oversight if legitimate leadership was annihilated. In other words, they were fail-deadly switches, and if someone ever activated them, it meant the world had already begun to burn. As more details trickled out, partial lists of other potential sites in Bavaria, the Ardennes, and rural Tuscany, it became clear that Station 12D was just one node in a forgotten chain, a phantom nervous system designed to wake only in nightmare scenarios. But the final question, the one that would keep investigators and historians awake for months to come, was this: why, if Silent Wire was never activated, had the Namur bunker been sealed while still fully operational, as if its operators had vanished without ever being told to stand down? What began as a forgotten shed on a Belgian farm was now understood to be one node in a vast, invisible nervous system NATO had once codenamed the Ghost Network, a clandestine latticework of communications infrastructure designed to endure the unthinkable, a decapitation strike that would render Washington, Brussels, and London vapor and ash. Declassified fragments of silent wire documentation, pried loose by a persistent coalition of journalists, veterans, and Cold War scholars, painted a picture that defied conventional military thinking of the era. Instead of relying solely on centralized hubs and fortified headquarters, NATO had secretly funded and built dozens, possibly hundreds, of decentralized fallback relay stations scattered across rural Europe, each disguised as something innocuous: a dairy farm in Luxembourg, a monastery in northern Italy, a forest ranger's outpost in Bavaria, even a church rectory in southern France. Beneath these facades, interconnected, through deeply buried microwave transmission lines, hardened fiber optic trunks, and radio repeaters built to blend into utility sheds or grain silos, lay the Ghost Network, a parallel grid capable of functioning independently of major cities, command centers, or even NATO itself. Station 12D, beneath its crooked Belgian shed, had not been a standalone facility, but an uplink node, capable of bouncing encrypted messages through passive antennas, buried in hayfields, and patched into subnetworks that led east toward West Germany, south into central France, and, via ultra-long wave bursts, directly to submarines in the Atlantic. The design was brilliant in its subtlety. By avoiding obvious military structures, the system slipped beneath the gaze of Soviet reconnaissance satellites and sidestepped KGB informants trained to watch known installations. The Soviets, whose own networks relied more heavily on hardened command centers, had underestimated NATO's willingness to decentralize. Authority in the event of annihilation. Each Ghost Network node contained two-way encrypted communication systems, automatic message redundancy algorithms, and authentication sequences that could, if required, validate nuclear launch commands relayed through the chaos of war. In effect, they were fallback brains, not built to launch weapons themselves, but to make sure the right orders reached the people who could. An intercepted Soviet analysis from 1985, released after the fall of the USSR, had flagged what it called potential irregular signal activity near a Belgian agricultural sector, suggesting that, even then, Soviet intelligence had sensed there was something strange, something too quiet, in places like Namur. But without visual confirmation or signal triangulation, it remained suspicion without evidence. NATO had gambled that in a conflict where seconds mattered, ambiguity could be a weapon, and they were right. What emerged from the Ghost Network's partial reconstruction was a sobering realization. NATO had prepared not only for nuclear war, but for the collapse of civilization's decision-making apparatus. And these bunkers, buried beneath ordinary lives and mundane scenery, were silent guardians of continuity in a world that once teetered on the edge of oblivion. But the darker implication now crept into focus. If Station 12D was designed to survive a catastrophe, then what did it mean that it had been sealed and abandoned without any sign of retreat? Who had ordered the silence? And who had obeyed? As investigators traced the origins of Station 12D further into the murk of Cold War bureaucracy, they unearthed a chilling fragment of personnel data buried deep within a forgotten NATO administrative archive, stored on microfiche at SHAPE's former auxiliary records facility in Mons. A partial roster marked Unit 47, SIGCOM/APSEC, clearance, Yo Black, reassignment, pending, classified. The names were few. Just 7 individuals listed as having been deployed to the Namur relay site between late 1987 and early 1989, including 2 cryptologic officers, 3 radio operators, a systems technician, and a field logistics NCO. Beyond that sparse log, nothing. No departure records, no end-of-deployment notes, no personnel transfers, no exit interviews, not even medical records. In most NATO units, such a disappearance from the paperwork would raise suspicions of data loss or administrative oversight, but this was different. Each service record stopped, without explanation, on or around August 11, 1989, the same month as the wall calendar found frozen inside the bunker. Most haunting of all, the final communication log, still legible on a roll of heat-sensitive tape fed into a dusty Siemens telex machine, showed routine encrypted status updates up until that exact date, including one last line of chilling ambiguity. Verification failed, contingency lockout initiated, standby for Echo Echo 7. After that, nothing. Investigators scoured every NATO personnel registry from 1989 through 91. Unit 47 was never reassigned, never rotated out, never absorbed into another signals group. Their call signs went dark. Internal NATO memos suggested some higher-ups viewed Unit 47 as a mission ghost, a transient cell assembled for an exceptional task, with records intentionally fragmented across jurisdictions to avoid traceability. But others, particularly retired operations officers familiar with Silent Wire's protocols, found that explanation disturbingly convenient. "You don't just lose a team like that," said Commander Lionel Kurz, former NATO ComSec officer, in a closed-door panel. "If there's no reassignment and no remains, you're not looking at a clerical error, you're looking at a sealed event." Worse still, when families of two of the operators were quietly contacted by a parliamentary subcommittee, they reported having received no formal notification of their relatives' disappearance. Only vague letters in 990 thanking them for their service and requesting discretion in matters relating to regional security deployment. No medals, no closure, and when one family pressed for more details, they were told, ominously, that further inquiry would not serve national interest. The forensic team that examined the bunker found no signs of struggle or evacuation. Beds were made, dishes were clean, terminals had been powered down in sequence, not abandoned mid-use. It was as boss if Unit 47 had received some final instruction and complied with it perfectly, to the letter, vanishing in obedience to an order that no longer existed on paper. The human mystery was now at the heart of the investigation. 7 people assigned to a facility that didn't exist, who carried out tasks no one could explain, and then disappeared without leaving behind so much as a fingerprint or a forwarding address. Station 12D wasn't just a bunker anymore, it was a grave without bodies. It was during a quiet lunch in a Wiltshire Village pub that Group Captain Arthur Lennox, retired Royal Air Force signals officer and once part of NATO's Joint Electronic Warfare Tasking Group, casually mentioned something that froze his younger interviewer mid-bite. A brief but unexplainable spike in encrypted signal traffic in November of 1989, days after the Berlin Wall fell, originating from what was then believed to be an inactive relay grid somewhere in southern Belgium. Lennox, who had overseen Allied signal monitoring in Western Europe for much of the late 80s, remembered it vividly because it was the only time in his career that a frequency was flagged as non-existent by every NATO database, and yet broadcast continuously, pulsing in 4-hour cycles for exactly 72 hours. The signal had been caught by a passive monitoring station at RAF Menwith Hill, logged as Phantom Echo Delta 12.417 MHz, but dismissed at the time as a legacy artifact from AEs. A decommissioned node, or perhaps a Soviet probe. But when Lennox saw the newly released photos of the Belgian bunker, the same frequency bandwidth painted faintly on one of the radio terminal panels, the NATO uplink dish rusted in its own grave. He knew it couldn't be coincidence. The signal wasn't just random. It followed NATO's Q-pattern burst protocol, used exclusively by high-clearance nodes during nuclear deadlock scenarios, a code that was supposed to be erased from operational knowledge by 1986. The broadcasts had been scrambled, dense with digital noise and odd carrier tones, but spectrogram analysis at the time showed bursts spaced at 13-minute intervals, not consistent with Soviet systems, not Eastern Bloc, but absolutely Western. Yet when Lennox had flagged the anomaly up the chain, the response had been curt. Drop it. That was the last time anyone in his circle spoke of it, until now. The revelation reopened a chilling line of inquiry among those investigating Station 12D, that in the confusion of the Eastern Bloc collapse, when embassies were shuttering and command structures fracturing, something inside that bunker may have reactivated. But by whom? The official Cold War communications wind-down had begun in early 1989, with most secure frequencies being phased out or rerouted through newer, centralized NATO infrastructure. No units were authorized to use the old fallback lines, especially not ones on frequencies that weren't supposed to exist. And yet this signal had cut through the chaos, broadcasting into a world that no longer had a reason to listen. Was it an automated fallback trigger? A last-ditch attempt by Unit 47 to signal for extraction? Or something worse, a command protocol activated in error or without oversight by an abandoned node waking up in the dark. The Soviets, already in freefall, had taken note too. KGB signal intercept records from Prague, declassified after the USSR's collapse, mention anomalous NATO burst patterns in Belgium on November 14th, 16th. But the Kremlin had been too distracted to act, and the signal eventually stopped. Just stopped. No termination code, no fade out, just silence, as if whoever or whatever had been transmitting had said what it needed to say and then disappeared forever. The most damning revelation came not from a document, but from a voice, hollow, distorted, and fed through an encrypted audio line during an off-the-record conversation with an investigative journalist in Cologne, a man who claimed to be a former NATO cryptographer assigned to a sub-program within Silent Wire, known only by its unofficial nickname, Cicada Black. His words painted a far darker picture of Station 12D, one that blurred the lines between defense and deception, loyalty and manipulation. According to him, not all Silent Wire bunkers were built for survival. Some were designed for observation, not of the enemy, but of NATO's own member states. He described a series of deployments beginning in the early 1980s, in which communications analysts and cryptologists were embedded at fallback relay stations under the guise of standard readiness drills, but whose true orders came directly from intelligence branches operating outside formal NATO hierarchy, specifically from the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology and a compartmentalized counterintelligence cell based in Langley. Their mission was to intercept and decode internal NATO transmissions, diplomatic communiques, wargame strategies, classified assessments, not to pass them to adversaries, but to monitor the behavior of allies. In the wake of increasing friction over U.S. nuclear deployment in Europe, and amid fears of espionage within friendly governments, the Americans had allegedly greenlit a project to surveil their own partners under the rationale of strategic redundancy. It was paranoia in practice. The cryptographer explained that agents at sites like Station 12D operated under split chains of command, one visible, one buried. They reported to NATO ComSec on paper, but were under direct instruction from shadowed American handlers via cold-burn secure lines. Messages weren't just relayed, they were filtered, logged, and stored for later analysis. And more alarmingly, some of the operators weren't soldiers or analysts at all. They were dual-role agents, some with real names scrubbed from NATO registries, others carrying alternate IDs approved by black-budget executive authorizations. It wasn't a relay, the voice said. It was a listening post, a scalpel buried in a handshake. When asked directly whether Station 12D could have been one such site, he responded, "If it was sealed, fully intact, and there's no record of the crew being rotated out, then yes, it was probably a closed-eye site, eyes that watch the watchers." The implication shattered the sanitized narrative of Silent Wire as a last-resort survival system. If some bunkers had been turned inward, aimed at allies rather than adversaries, what had begun as a network of protection may have mutated into one of political control. The idea that democratic nations, bound by treaty and trust, had been quietly monitoring one another through buried bunkers was incendiary, but not implausible. During the Cold War, the line between ally and liability was paper-thin. And now, with Station 12D rising from decades of silence, the ghosts inside it were beginning to whisper secrets no one had been meant to hear. Because in the end, the most dangerous kind of bunker wasn't the one built to survive a nuclear war. It was the one built to survive scrutiny. The document surfaced quietly, slipped into a parliamentary archive update under a bland title referencing Cold War Infrastructure Review Addendum, but buried within its yellowed pages was a paragraph that drained all remaining comfort from the Station 12D investigation. A contingency directive authorizing on-site commanders, in the event of imminent exposure or hostile compromise, to neutralize station integrity by all necessary means. The language was deliberately opaque, crafted by lawyers and strategists who understood the power of ambiguity. Yet, Cold War historians and former signals officers knew exactly what it implied. Neutralizing integrity did not merely mean smashing radios or burning codebooks. In Omega clearance doctrine, integrity referred to the totality of the station, hardware, data, operational knowledge, and personnel. A living operator was as much a liability as an intact transmitter. The order was designed for worst-case scenarios: enemy breach, Allied betrayal, political collapse. And now, standing in the dust-filled silence of the Namur bunker, investigators were forced to confront the possibility that Unit 47 had obeyed that order. Forensic teams had found no bullet casings, no bloodstains, no signs of struggle, but they also found something else: advanced fire suppression systems that would have erased biological traces within minutes, chemical neutralizers embedded in ventilation ducts, and emergency medical kits conspicuously unopened. The beds were made, the uniforms missing, the lockers empty except for folded NATO manuals stacked with ritualistic neatness. If there had been violence, it had been controlled. If there had been death, it had been planned. The emotional weight of that realization settled heavily over everyone who entered the bunker thereafter. 7 people, specialists, analysts, human beings, may have been asked to erase themselves to preserve a secret that outlived the war it was built for. And if they complied, it would explain everything: the sealed hatch, the intact equipment, the lack of records, the absence of bodies. Some experts suggested alternative interpretations: covert extraction, falsified deaths, identity reassignment, but these theories faltered against the cold precision of the directive and the finality of the site's closure. Families had never received remains. No graves existed. No names were etched into memorials. Unit 47 had become a silence, a gap in history where lives should have been. One Belgian investigator, after weeks on the case, reportedly requested reassignment, later telling a colleague that the bunker felt less like a military site and more like a confession. The tragedy of Station 12D was not written in explosions or gunfire, but in obedience, the kind demanded by institutions that prepare for apocalypse and expect their servants to disappear with it. Whether Unit 47 died beneath that field or walked away into carefully constructed anonymity may never be known. But the cost was the same: 7 people swallowed by a war that officially ended without them. The shed above their station still stood, weathered and quiet, while beneath it lay the possibility that the Cold War's most enduring casualty was not a city or a nation, but a handful of lives erased so completely that even history hesitated to remember them. They buried the hatch in late spring, sealing it with 3 feet of reinforced concrete and a welded plate marked only with a reference number. No plaque, no ceremony, no trace of what had once stirred beneath the soil. The shed was dismantled plank by plank, and the land was sown over with grass again, as if erasure could somehow undo the weight of what had been discovered. To the unknowing eye, it became once more a quiet Belgian field, but those who had descended into Station 12D would never see it that way again. Beneath their boots had lain not just concrete and cables, but the fossilized outline of a world built on fear, a world in which silence was engineered as carefully as weapons, and where human beings were embedded like circuit components, meant to vanish with the power grid when the lights of civilization blinked out. The Cold War had officially ended in '91, with treaties signed and flags lowered, but the truths buried beneath it had simply gone deeper, in the wake of Station 12D, historians, journalists, and defense experts came to a sobering consensus. The Cold War hadn't just been a contest of missiles and ideology, but of architecture, a war that reshaped the very ground we walk on, embedding secrets into basements, forests, sewers, and sheds. Across Europe, investigators began re-examining other innocuous structures: the old train depot outside Munich, the bell tower in rural Italy, the unplumbed cellar of a Scottish lighthouse, and found new meaning in their anomalies. Landscapes had been altered not for beauty or agriculture, but for contingency and silence. Station 12D had become emblematic of this shadow terrain, a monument not to war, but to the machinery of waiting for war. What lingered was not the memory of bombs or battles, but of preparation without end, of protocols written to persist beyond governments, beyond peace, even beyond logic. And most haunting of all was the human toll, not in lives lost through fire, but in identities erased by design. The operators of Unit 47, the planners of Silent Wire, the agents embedded to listen not to enemies, but to allies. They had been the custodians of a ghost world, and now that world was being remembered, not celebrated, but reckoned with. As one historian wrote in a classified assessment that would later leak to the press, the Cold War did not leave battlefields, it left shadows. And those shadows endure, cast by silent structures and unacknowledged sacrifices, by maps redrawn not with borders, but with absence. Station 12D was no longer just a shed with a hatch. It was a symbol, a reminder that the Cold War never truly ended. It was buried. And sometimes, the Earth gives its secrets back. If this story gripped you, if the idea of buried secrets, vanished operatives, and forgotten bunkers makes your pulse quicken, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another Cold War mystery we uncover. There are more hidden histories waiting to be told. Stay curious and stay alert.